Hello everyone, and welcome back to If It's Math. Today we're going to continue our series on real numbers as part of our Fundamentals of Algebra content. In parts 1 and 2 of our real number series, we talked through the basics of number sets and what some common number sets are. And in this video, what we'll do is talk about some of the important properties of real numbers, including the commutative, associative, and distributive properties, as well as the double negative rule. So by the end of this video, you'll be able to recognize and use all those properties, which are really critical for almost everything that follows in algebra. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about a property, all this really is a fundamental rule that you can always rely on to be true as you work with numbers. Or later, once we start working with variables, it works the same way with those variables. So some of these that we talk through might seem really simple at this point, but they're going to be really important, and they'll get more complicated once we start throwing in variables. So the first property that we'll talk about is the commutative property, and this applies to addition and multiplication. So what the commutative property tells you is that the order that you add numbers, so this order that you add the numbers, and the order that you multiply numbers does not matter. So that order is not what's essential there. So let's think about how we actually would write that out. So let's say we have A plus B. That is going to be the same thing as B plus A. And then when you think about multiplication, if you have A times B, that's going to be the same thing as B times A. So let's think of it as an example real quick. So let's say we have 7 plus 6. Well, that's 13. And we know that 6 plus 7 is also 13. So that's just an example there. So for multiplication as well, you've got the same thing. So let's say you had 2 times 9. Well, that's 18. And we know that 9 times 2 also equals 18. So that's really all this commutative property is telling you, is that the order you add in or the order that you multiply in doesn't matter. But one of the really important things to keep in mind is this is not true for subtraction or for division. So you really have to keep that in mind. When you're thinking about this commutative property, it only applies to adding and multiplying. So let's just look at an example there to show that. So A minus B does not equal B minus A. So let's say we had 7 minus 3. We know that that equals 4, but 3 minus 7 equals negative 4. So same thing with division. We know that A divided by B does not equal B divided by A. So let's look at, say, 9 divided by 3. So you have 9 divided by 3. Well, that's going to give you 3. But 3 divided by 9 is going to give you 1/3. So that's the important part with the commutative property. It's just that, again, the order that you add and the order that you multiply does not matter, but it is not true for subtraction or division. Okay, so the next property we have is the associative property. And once again, this associative property is just for addition and for multiplication. It's not for the others. What this property tells us is that the way you group addition using parentheses does not matter, and the way that you group multiplication using parentheses also does not matter. So let's think about what that means. So if we have A plus B plus C, that is the same thing as A plus B plus C. And then the same thing with multiplication. So if you have AB times C, that is going to be the same thing as A times BC. So it's basically saying that you can group them how you need to. That's what that associative property means. You can associate them how you need. So let's look at an example. So if we have 5 plus 4 plus 8, that's going to give us 9 plus 8, which is 17. And if we had done 5 plus 4 plus 8, That would have given us 5 plus 12, which is 17. And then the same thing with multiplication. If we had, let's say, 3 times 5 times 2, well, that's going to give us 15 times 2, which is 30. And same thing, if we had had 3 times 5 times 2, that would give us 3 times 10, which is 30. So that's how you can see how that associative property for addition and multiplication plays out. But again, the important thing to keep in mind with this is that it is not true for subtraction or division. So let's look at that to see. So if we have A minus B minus C, that is not going to be the same thing as A minus B minus C. And on the multiplication or on the division side, same thing. A divided by B divided by C is not the same thing as A divided by B divided by C. So let's look at a couple of examples here just to reinforce how this isn't the case. So let's say that we had 12 minus 3 minus 1. So that is going to equal 9 minus 1, which equals 8. But if we did 12 minus 3 minus 1, that would be 12 minus 2, which is 10. So you can see that that's not true. And then if we look at the division side as well, an example for division. So with division, if we are looking at, say, 24 divided by 6, then divided by 2, that's going to equal 4 divided by 2, which is 2. But if you do 24 divided by 6 divided by 2, you would have 24 divided by 3, which equals 8. So again, that shows you that this associative property is only true for addition and multiplication and does not apply for subtraction or division. So the next property is the distributive property. So what this tells us is kind of how to interact addition and multiplication together. So what this tells us, this distributive property, is that if you add two numbers and then multiply them by a third number, it's the same thing as if you multiplied each of the two numbers by that third number and then added the result. So that's pretty wordy. It's kind of hard to understand what that means. So let's think about that in notation form. So if we have A times B plus C, that is the same thing as AB plus AC. Now, the thing about the distributive property is it also works if you're subtracting in the middle there. So if you have A times B minus C, that's the same thing as AB minus AC. So let's take a look at an example just to reinforce this. So if we had 7 times 3 plus 6, that is 7 times 9, and 7 times 9 is 63. But if we did that distributive component, you would have 7 times 3 plus 7 times 6, and that gives you 21 plus 42, which is 63. So you can distribute that 7 across the 3 and the 6. That's what you call that. And let's take a look at one that has subtraction in there. So if you have 5 times 7 minus 3, that's going to give you 5 times 4, which gives you 20. And same thing, if you've done 5 times 7 minus 5 times 3, that would give you 35 minus 15, which equals 20. So the thing with this distributive property, it is not true for division. So when we think about that in that notation format we've been looking at, it tells you that if you have A divided by B plus C, that is not the same thing as A divided by B plus A divided by C. Those just don't come out to be the same thing. So let's look at an example there just to show you. So if we had 36 divided by 9 plus 3. Okay, well, that is the same thing as 36 divided by 12, which is 3. But if you had done 36 divided by 9 plus 36 divided by 3, then you would have gotten 36 divided by 9, you'd have 4 plus 12, which is 16. And so you can see that that's not true. So the key thing with this distributive property is it works with multiplication with addition or subtraction inside those parentheses. Okay, one more rule, and this one is for subtraction. So this is the double negative rule for subtraction. What it tells you is that when you subtract a negative number, that's the same thing as adding the positive version of that number. So what this is going to be is if you have A minus negative B, that is the same thing as A plus B. So let's look at an example here. If you had 6 minus negative 3, then that is the same thing as 6 plus 3, which is going to give you 9. So that's that rule there, is that if you are subtracting a negative, that turns into adding. Sounds pretty straightforward. There's one more double negative rule, and that's multiplication. And so what this one tells you is that if you multiply two negative numbers together, the result is always positive. So in notation form, if you have negative A times negative B, that is the same thing as AB. So for an example, let's say that we had negative 1 times negative 7. That is going to be the same thing as 1 times 7, which is 7. And if you had negative 3 times negative 6, that is going to be the same thing as 3 times 6, which is 18. So that's that double negative rule for multiplication. It's just if you multiply two negatives together, you're always going to end up with a positive. Okay, so let's do a quick summary of everything that we've learned. So when we look at the commutative property, remember this applies to addition and to multiplication. It's telling us the order that you add numbers and the order that you multiply numbers does not matter. So what this one gave us was A plus B is the same thing as B plus A, and then AB is the same thing as BA. Then on that associative property, again for addition and multiplication, it was telling us that the way you group addition or multiplication using parentheses does not matter. So if you have A plus B plus C, that's the same as A plus B plus C. And then when you're looking at the multiplication side of it, if you have AB times C, that is the same thing as A times BC. And the next one that we had was this distributive property. So on the distributive property side, and this was looking at multiplication, it was telling us if you add two numbers together and multiply them by a third number, that's the same as multiplying each of the two numbers by that third and then adding those results together. That's the wordiest one of all these. It always makes so much more sense when you write it out in the symbol form. So this was saying if you have A times B plus C, that is just AB plus AC. And then remember, this also worked for subtraction. So if you have A times B minus C, that is going to be the same thing as AB minus AC. So remember, that one does not work for division. So then on the double negative rule for subtraction, this one tells us that when you subtract a negative number, it's the same as adding the positive of that number. So if you have A minus negative B, that is the same thing as A plus B. And the last one we took a look at was this double negative rule for multiplication. And what this tells us is if you multiply two negatives together, the result is positive. So if you have negative A times negative B, the answer will be AB. And that's all there is to the properties of real numbers. Please like this video if it was helpful. Subscribe to our channel to be the first to know about new content. And always remember that if it's math, we have the solution.